Okay, so I think we'll get started. Welcome to those just joining, and thank you for being part of today's discussion on migrant worker rights. We had about 150 people RSVP for the webinar, and it's great to see so much interest in this important topic. My name's Lorraine Hudson, and I work in community engagement at Interpares. I'm joined by several colleagues today, including Bill Fairbairn, who will introduce our panelists shortly and moderate the discussion, and Charlotte Cadell, who is available for tech support if you're experiencing any difficulty with the webinar platform. We're very excited to have with us today activists and friends of Interpares, Min Sook Lee, Gabriel Allahdua, and Karen Cocq. In the audience, we're pleased to have Interpares supporters and allies and members of the broader public brought together by a shared interest in migrant worker rights. Before we launch the discussion, I'll say a few words about Interpares and mention a few housekeeping notes. Interpares, which means Among Equals, is a feminist social justice organization in Ottawa that believes in solidarity as an approach to international cooperation. Our office is located on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Omami-Wenini people, and we express our profound gratitude to them. Interpares' programs largely focus on 6 global issues: food sovereignty, gender justice, peace and democracy, economic justice, health, and migration. We work with long-term counterparts, local and national activist organizations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Canada. For more information, please visit our website, interpares.ca, or find us on social media. On the housekeeping side of things, I'd like to note that for this webinar, attendees are in view-only mode. This means that only hosts and panelists can turn on their video and microphone. Also, we're recording this webinar to make it available to those unable to join us tonight. If you have any technical difficulties or questions, please type a message in the chat box and Charlotte will be happy to respond. If you'd like to pose a question to our panelists, please type it in the Q&A box, which I will be monitoring. Following brief remarks by my colleague Bill, each of the 3 panelists will have 10 minutes to present. This will be followed by approximately half an hour of Q&A and closing remarks, including about opportunities for you to take action on migrant worker rights. We anticipate that there will be many questions for our great panelists, and we will answer as many of them as possible. I'll now hand it over to Bill, who has had the pleasure of collaborating directly with our panelists.
Great, thanks, Lorraine, and good evening to everyone who's joining us here tonight, and especially to our 3 wonderful panelists. In these days of physical isolation, these types of virtual spaces are a safe way we can come together right now. They don't replace the intimacy of face-to-face gatherings, but we're grateful they're allowing us to connect tonight to talk about an issue that's so relevant and so urgent. My friend Evelyn Encalada, a co-founder of Justicia for Migrant Workers, and someone who features in Min Sook's film Migrant Dreams, posted a meme on our Facebook page the other day. It said, "Instead of praising people for being resilient, change the systems that are making them vulnerable." COVID has been described as inequality on steroids, and the pandemic has given visibility and laid bare some of the deep cracks and injustices that are inherent in so many of our systems, both within and among countries and peoples. Not the least of these is our food system, a system that relies so heavily on the sweat of migrant workers who do not enjoy the same fundamental labor and human rights here as we do as Canadian citizens or permanent residents. Their precarious immigration status, which considers them only as temporary workers, puts them constantly in situations of risk and vulnerability. And there are many people, not only employers, but also average consumers, who consciously or unconsciously are quite prepared to allow them to be exploited. Over the past 2 months, we've heard devastating reports in the media of the death of 3 Mexican farm workers. Bonifacio Eugenio Romero, 31 years old, Rogelio Muñoz Santos, 24, and Juan Lopez Chaparro, 55 years old. We remember them, and we remember their families and communities tonight. These were preventable deaths. All 3 men died in southern Ontario, the first two in Windsor, Essex, and the third in the Simcoe region. To date, over 1,000 farm workers have tested positive for COVID-19 in Ontario alone. This was a disaster waiting to happen, and activist groups such as those here tonight raised alarm bells at the very onset of the pandemic. Over the past months, these groups have been conducting visits and speaking to the workers. They've been documenting what's happening now on the farms. They've been releasing video footage of the overcrowded conditions many workers face. And they've been delivering personal protective equipment and food kits to workers whose employers refuse to meet even these most basic standards and needs. And as always, but even more so now, activists are shouting from the rooftops about the urgent need to ensure the safety of the workers, and they're calling on our government to totally revamp the programs that treat workers as disposable and enable them to remain in situations of such vulnerability. So we're going to move ahead now with the next part of our evening and hear directly from our guests. Our first speaker tonight is Min Sook Lee. Min Sook is an award-winning filmmaker, a screenwriter, community activist, and a cherished collaborator with Interpares. She's an associate professor at the Ontario College of Art and Design University, where she teaches art and social change. Min Sook ran for public office last year as a candidate for the 2019 Canadian federal election, representing the riding of Toronto-Danforth. Min Sook, you've been working alongside migrant justice activists for decades now to expose the realities that many migrant workers face in Canada. You've produced two amazing documentaries on this subject, El Contrato in 2003 and Migrant Dreams in 2016, which Interpares was so proud to support and which once again, we encourage participants to check out if you haven't seen it before tonight. We sent out the link and we can send that again. Could you please talk a bit about the concerns that you've seen and you've documented, both about the programs themselves and about the conditions that migrant workers face? What were some of the main issues and concerns facing migrant workers before the pandemic?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, Bill, and thank you for letting me speak in this panel with Justice for Migrant Workers and for Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, because these are two organizations that are doing such important work right now in hope and realizing change in this moment, which is so crucial. I think maybe the best way is to talk about how I came to make documentaries and learn what many Canadians now are just learning about Canada's migrant worker program, is to cycle back to 1998. And I was thinking about the first time I heard about migrant workers in Leamington, Ontario, which is just 4 hours outside of Toronto. And I met a friend of mine, Chris Ramsarub, who told me about a wildcat strike that workers had organized in Leamington, Ontario. And he was organizing filmmakers and media people to go to Leamington to find out what was going on. And I remember very, very pointedly in my head thinking, I thought migrant workers and the issues around migrant worker rights was an American problem. I didn't know that migrant workers and the migrant worker program was so widespread, so fundamental to our agribusiness industries. And I was really quite shocked when I went with Chris to Leamington, Ontario on a bus. When we arrived on a Sunday afternoon, we got out of the bus and there was about 5 or 6 other people with us. And anyone who spoke Spanish in particular was very important in that one trip, because we arrived at the parking lot of the church in Leamington, where all the workers had just recently, and it was a Mexican community of workers in Leamington, workers had just recently gone to the service, and we're all in the parking lot. There must have been about 200 or 300 workers. And once they knew that we had come from Toronto and there were people who spoke Spanish with us, they had so many questions, and they were surrounding the Spanish speakers with questions about access to healthcare. People were rolling up their sleeves showing, you know, skin lesions and reactions, chemical reactions to pesticide use in the farms. People were actually carrying their contracts and had questions about deductions. There were workers who were speaking about food shortages in the farm that they were working in, not having proper access to food, overcrowded living conditions. And I was really struck that this is a legal labor program, it's a federal program, and workers are in Canada who do not have access to information. In many ways are isolated. And it made me understand that oftentimes there's this myth of Canada the good. And we do like to think of this country as tolerant. You know, that word has been, you know, thrown around quite often as a champion of human rights and a land of opportunity. And this kind of myth of Canada the good prevails oftentimes because stories are not being told. They don't come through to the mainstream media. And those who have power control the narrative, and that is a form of power, so those stories don't come out. And what's happened now is the story of migrant workers has broken through, and people are realizing that there's a problem, there's a crisis. But this crisis existed prior to COVID-19 and prior to the pandemic. There's over about 500,000, over 500,000 migrant workers who are working in Canada with temporary status. And they come from over 80 different source countries. And of that number, over 100,000 are low wage, minimum wage workers, workers who are tied to one job and one employer. So they are indentured. Fundamentally, they are indentured to an employer. Means that employer can control their livelihood, their employment in Canada, and has an outsized amount of control over a worker's mobility, over their living and working conditions. And we have to understand the history of this program, which began, sort of the contemporary version of this program, began in 1966. And it started when about 260 Jamaican migrant workers came to work on farms in Ontario. And the federal government began to build the migrant worker program because it supported farmers and the agricultural industry. And fundamentally, it has become a program that subsidizes the industry that's making billions of profit. And it allows the federal government to not address immigration issues and immigration legislation. So it ensures that systemic racism is embedded in our immigration system because there's a temporary labor program which brings in workers primarily from the global south to do the kind of work that Canadians don't want to do, the 3D work, dirty, difficult, and dangerous work. And so oftentimes you hear that the temporary foreign worker program is about temporary jobs, and workers are fulfilling, you know, short-term labor shortages, and that's not true. The job shortage is chronic, and the program itself provides a permanent access to bosses and to corporations to fundamentally unfree labor. So it's the worker's status as unfree. That's what makes the program and the industry so profitable. Workers are tied to an employer during the entire term of their employment, and there's very little labor or social mobility. There's an over-reliance on that one employer, your boss, for housing, for transportation, for access to healthcare, and it creates a relationship that you know, is broadly discussed and presented, and you know, it looks like this is what modern day indentureship looks like. So you have a citizen boss, almost like a citizen tyrant, who wields this exorbitant amount of power over you. And for migrant workers, oftentimes it's the employer who brought you into the country and who can kick you out. So the system itself invites abuse. And there are many instances. There are many, many reports of abuse, of unpaid wages, of limited access or untimely access to healthcare, unsafe working conditions. Workers have died on farms. Overcrowded accommodations, sexual abuse, harassment, extreme forms of racism and abusive working conditions, and then questionable payroll deductions and non-payment of overtime. There's a litany of recorded, documented abuses, and the federal government is aware of this. And I think one piece of Canada's migrant worker program that is particularly egregious that people need to understand is it invites a kind of a bit of a, how would I describe it? It's like a pyramid scheme almost, in that the temporary foreign worker program, the functioning of it, which is deeply problematic, is the role that private recruiters pay. Because many migrant workers come into Canada by paying a private recruiter exorbitant agency fees. And sometimes these fees, they range from $6,000 to $12,000 to a private recruiter to work in Canada's temporary foreign worker program. And because the fees are so high, some workers arrive heavily indebted to this private recruiter, the broker. And the broker is essentially the middle person who is supporting the employer, bringing workers into Canada's greenhouses and farms. So this is kind of a modern form of debt bondage. And I've seen it played out, not just in Canada, but you know, when I was in Doha and when I was in Seoul, Korea, I've seen this pattern and this program. There's a global framework to it. It's the coloniality of this program, or the global coloniality of this program that's in particular, you know, really concerning. So I think I just want to leave it there and just add one more piece to it, in that the history of the program itself, you know, predates the temporary version that was established in 1966, and that Canada has always had migrant worker programs. There have always been migrant worker programs funneling workers in who are not desired as citizens, who are not wanted as permanent citizens, because they don't fundamentally mirror the idea or the construction of what Canada is. And so I can, you know, you can go right back to the Chinese 1800s, who were working to get the railroads. And that was, you know, one of the oldest forms of the migrant worker program that we see today. And in many ways, it's fundamentally has not changed.
Thanks, Min. I think that you've raised so many issues that are really a number of them are dealt with in the films that you produce. And I think that, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for helping to shed light about what's happening and to raise awareness among people, because it's really hidden. We'll go now to our second panelist tonight, who is Gabriel Allahdua. Gabriel is a former farm worker from St. Lucia and an organizer with Justicia for Migrant Workers. Justicia, or Justice for Migrant Workers, it's a volunteer-run activist collective that supports racialized and migrant workers. Inter Pares has had the honor of collaborating with Gabriel and Justicia on many occasions. Justicia has earned the trust of migrant workers. It's clear that, in their own words, the injustices faced by migrant workers are not happening because workers don't know their rights. It's because the system is rigged against them. So Gabriel, as a former migrant worker yourself, you know firsthand about the types of concerns that Min Sook just spoke about so eloquently. Can you tell us a bit about the work that Justicia has been doing these past months in support of migrant workers, and tell us how COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation that that migrant workers were already facing before the pandemic started?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Extra special greetings to each and everyone in Zoom land tonight. I wanted to say a lot of things about the program, but my Min Sook has done a lot of things. I'll just show you a few things based on what she said. Basically, what she's told you is that migrant workers in Canada, we're just being milked. If you watch my chest, there's no more milk on my chest. So that is what the program is. It's a program that milks migrant workers, right? And also what she just told you is that once migrant workers are involved in the fruits, the vegetables, whatever, once migrant workers are involved, that there are 20 injustices. And these are things that I experienced. And I need to say quickly, because of time, I'll say quickly, in my home country, I express, in my home country, red and white means love. And I experienced the love of Canada on two very great occasions in my home country. Thanks to Canada, I completed a secondary school education. Thanks to Canada, at the lowest point in my life, with a family to support and in a country with no or very little social safety net, I got the opportunity to earn my livelihood in Canada. And I felt the love of Canada in my home country on two great occasions. But the sad truth is, the very moment I arrived in Canada, my expectations and my reality was different. And this is what I call the 20 dark sides of Canada. And I keep asking myself, when I look at that flag of Canada, I see a red leaf. In school, they taught me that a green leaf is the natural factory. That is where our food is being synthesized. When I see a leaf, to me, a leaf should be green because I think of food. But that red leaf in the flag of Canada is a constant reminder. In my home country, red means danger. And that red leaf reminds me of the danger that migrant workers face in the production of food and vegetables in Canada. My name is Gabriel. I'm from a very small Caribbean island named St. Lucia. I'm a former migrant worker, as you heard, and I'm now an organizer and a speaker for the group Justice for Migrant Workers. That group, what do we do basically? In a nutshell, what do? We educate, we organize, we advocate, we empower, we inspire, we pressure politicians, and ultimately we try to push people into action, to pressure the politicians. I am loud because I want a Canadian food system that is healthy, that is sustainable, and that is just. And I need to tell you, and that's what Min Sook just told you, that the Canadian system makes it legal for the exploitation of the soil, for the exploitation of the environment, and for the exploitation of workers. The program that brought me to Canada, you all heard, started in 1966. And what is that program? That program very simply is like a tree to me. That program very simply is like a telephone number to me. Min Sook just told you that that program started in 1966. So that program is like a tree. That program started in 1966. It started in Jamaica, as you all heard. In that telephone number 3, the three simple parts of the tree, the stem, the branches, the leaves. The 3 pillars of that program are: 1, I am in Canada because of the stem of that program. I am in Canada to do all the D jobs that Min Sook told you, the 3 Ds, the dirty jobs, the difficult jobs, the dangerous jobs. And all of these jobs are non-unionized jobs. Can you imagine the working conditions associated with a non-unionized job? And that's the program. Number 2, the branches. The federal government sees it fit to bring us to do those dirty jobs. And by the way, look, that's the other thing COVID is revealing. Right now, because of COVID, unemployment is up. Maybe that's the highest it has been for so long, right? Isn't that the best time for Canadians to fill up the slack on the program? Why aren't Canadians doing it? Why? It's just a reflection of how dirty and difficult these jobs are, that's one. And there are farms where they offer up to like $25 an hour to a Canadian, which is again racial, and that is really, really highlighting how racist and unfair the program is. They offer Canadians $25, but yet they still struggling to get Canadians to do the job. Number 2, we are here to do those D jobs. The branches, we cannot apply for status. And in Canada, if you have status, you have rights. If you don't have status, you don't have rights. And as Min Sook told you, from over 100 years, from the time of the Chinese railroad workers, Canada have been using these 2 things: unjust labor laws, unjust immigration laws, to keep migrant workers vulnerable and precarious. From over 100 years, Canada continues to use those 2 things to work in tandem. And the leaves. So we are here to do those dirty jobs. We do not have status. We do not have the same rights as a Canadian. And number 3, the leaves, we are tied to our employer. So let me go over that. To be tied to your employer, to do these dirty jobs, not have the same rights as a Canadian. That's the program. Is that a fair program? Is that a just program? Is that in a country, of all things, in a country that prides itself as a champion for human rights? On the world stage, Canada presents itself as a country of love. Canada goes to China, talks to China. Canada goes to the UN and tells the UN that the same rights and privileges that its citizens enjoy, it will extend them to refugees. That's how Canada presents itself on the world stage. But quietly, Canada perpetuates 18th century working conditions. And at the top of that tree is what I would call number 20 in my telephone here. These are at the top of that tree here would be 20 fruits of that unjust tree. And these are the 20 dark sides of Canada. These are the 20 injustices that migrant workers face in Canada. I cannot touch all of them, but because the focus is on COVID tonight, I want to draw your attention now to the work that we are doing in relation to COVID. And I've numbered it and I've reduced it to keep for simplicity to 6 items. Number 1, imagine being in isolation for 14 days. You cannot leave the place, but being fed a food that is not suited for your culture. You cannot identify the food. Can you imagine that? Hunger is a real problem that migrant workers face during this COVID, during the quarantine period especially, and getting culturally appropriate food is a challenge for a lot of them. Not counting that a lot of the workers, language is a barrier, and the fact that you're confined and you're isolated and so many things against you. How do you get the food that is appropriate and sufficient food and culturally appropriate? So that is one of the things that a lot of our time goes into. That's one. Number 2, a big part of our work is medical interventions. We had to literally arm wrestle with the province to open the doors for healthcare, to make healthcare accessible to everyone, documented and undocumented. And that is a big part of our work, because so many migrant workers, they are so afraid to seek medical attention for fear of being deported. The fear of deportation and the language barrier, so many barriers against them, that this is a real challenge that a lot of our time goes into that, and COVID is really stretching us. The third area is we provide food boxes for migrant workers and undocumented workers. We were able to do that for farm workers in Brantford because of distance and so on. We have transportation. These are the challenges that we face, and that's what COVID is really doing. COVID is highlighting our that resources is important and in doing voluntary work. And in Toronto, it is generally, that is where we have the resources, and we generally provide food boxes for undocumented and people, migrant workers who are really in need in Toronto. Number 4, housing. That is a really big challenge. And I'm pretty sure you've been, well, over the past 2 months or so, you've been hearing about leaked documentaries, leaked video clips from workers. Look at the word, leaked. They have to smuggle it literally under the table. Is that a country of fairness? Is that a program that's just for look at that, we are the workers. That is the other problem COVID is highlighted. Right now, migrant farm workers, they are the epicenter. And do you hear from the workers? No, because the program has a lot of fear built into it. That is why the workers, you do not hear from the workers. And that is the kind of program. And where is that program taking place? In the US? No, right here under our nose. The food that you eat, the food that you're eating, the vegetables that you're eating, right here has injustice inside of it. That's our biggest challenge as a group, is to produce those fruits and vegetables. I'll talk to you about those injustices. That is why I'm really happy to be associated with Min Sook. I'm really happy to be sitting on a panel with her, because those 2 documentaries, they really set the foundation for me as a former migrant worker to reach out to you and to hate from me, from a former worker itself. Because without people like Min Sook, that's the thing with Canada, you know, according to a friend of mine, polite genocide. Canada is known as a country that is very polite genocide. That's how a friend puts it. Another person puts it as a culture of silence. And that is what Min Sook has done. She has break down that wall of fear, break down that wall of silence, and brought those documentaries right there to your home. Number 5, Today we were taking part in a divisional court in, let me see, Haldimand County, I think, somewhere in Brantford, where a farm is taking on the chief medical officer for housing. The chief medical officer instituted some of the conditions. One of them surround housing, that it is 3 workers per house during the quarantine period. So the farmer or the farm, they're challenging that in court, and we are now in, today was the session. I'm not too sure of the outcome or where, at what stage it is, but these are the works that the COVID is really pushing us into. And the last one I'll leave, and that might be, I consider that to be a really big fight. Right now, from 1966 to now, not one inquest. Remember, migrant workers come to Canada to do those dirty jobs, those difficult jobs, those dangerous jobs. Every year that I've been in Canada, at least one, at least two, at least three workers die every year. This year, so far, because of COVID, at least three workers have died, not one inquest. And that's the closest we've been to pushing for an inquest into the death of migrant workers. And can you imagine how much arm wrestling that's going on right now? How much of our time I'm wrestling with the coroner's office to push for an inquest. A lot of that. So that is what COVID is doing. It has really put the focus on migrant workers, but I'm telling you, it takes a lot of our time to bring equality and fairness. And that is why I'm really happy for this opportunity. And I'm pretty sure at the end, I'll tell you some of the things that you have. When you look at your hands, only my hands are needed in Canada. But when you look at your hands, there's a lot of power. And I'm hoping so that I'll be able to push you to use that power in your hands and bring a food system that's healthy, that's sustainable, and that's just. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Gabriel. That's you're such a powerful speaker. We're off to a great start, I think, about this reflection about some of the program itself and the injustices. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions at the end, but thanks again for that great presentation. Our final panelist tonight is Karen Cocq. Karen is campaigns coordinator for the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change and has been active in migrant justice, worker rights, and anti-poverty organizing for almost 2 decades now. Of course, at Inter-Pares, we're also proud to say that Karen was a former colleague of ours as program manager for Central America between 2007 and 2011. So welcome, Karen. The Migrant Workers Alliance for Change has been connecting with workers in the Niagara region and other parts of the country. You recently produced a detailed report of your findings, and you've been advocating for policy changes from the local up to the national level of government through the Migrant Rights Network. Can you expand a bit on what Min Sook and Gabriel have spoken about and talk specifically about what types of policy changes are needed now and what do we need to do to be supporting migrant workers at this time?
Hi, Bill. Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to all of the Inter-Pares colleagues, old and new. It's nice to be here and to be back with all of you in this new role. And thanks to everyone who has come out tonight to participate and hear from what have obviously been 2 amazing speakers who have a lot of experience and a wealth of information to share. And I think what I want to add really is sort of 2 pieces. I want to add a piece, not add, but I want to expand on 2 key pieces. And the first one is that I want to focus on workers and focus not just on the impact of the immigration system and the temporary farm worker program and the seasonal agricultural workers program on migrant workers, but I also want to talk about and the impact of COVID on migrant workers, but I want to talk about what migrant workers are doing to fight back and to organize and to assert the power that workers actually do have to defend their dignity and their rights. And then I want to talk a little bit about change, and change encompasses that first piece about workers and how central workers are and the self-organization of workers is to producing the kind of change that will resolve and fix and undo the damage of the immigration system as it's currently organized, and what migrant workers are doing right now to organize for change, and how supporters and those who do not have that direct lived experience can be active supporters and allies in that fight. So I want to start with the 3 workers that Bill mentioned earlier who died of COVID-19 as a result of their living and working conditions on Ontario farms. Bonifacio Eugenio Romero, Rogelio Muñoz Santos, and Juan Lopez Chaparro. Their deaths are the direct result of federal and provincial laws and policies, and the failure by all levels of government to respond to repeated warnings by advocates and migrant workers over decades about the deadly conditions of migrant farm work in this country. And immediate warnings, as Bill said, in the lead up to COVID-19, when we knew that the impending pandemic was in the context of those deplorable living and working conditions was only going to produce all of the outbreaks and the deaths that we are now seeing. I'll start with a little bit about MWAC, who the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change is. Migrant Workers Alliance for Change is both a coalition and an organization. We are a coalition of a number of organizations that organize for migrant and undocumented folks, of self-organized groups of migrant and undocumented people in Ontario. And we are also an organization. We have a small staff of organizers who organize directly with farm workers in the Niagara region, primarily of Ontario, and also with migrant students across the country, migrant students who work in low wage and precarious work and who have been very hard hit by COVID-19 and the intensification of work and the unsafe working conditions in low wage and precarious jobs. Like Bill said earlier, in June, we released a report on the state of farm work under COVID-19 that highlighted everything that Min Sook spoke of and everything that Gabriel spoke of about how the long-standing inequalities and injustices and violations that are faced by migrant farm workers are simply exacerbated under the context of COVID-19. We called the report unheeded warnings, and there was a reason for that. The report was drawn from about 2 months worth of phone calls from migrant farm workers, approximately 180 workers who called on behalf of almost 1,200 workers, primarily from the Niagara region because that's where our base is, but also from across the country, over a 2-month period. That was really a snapshot of what we have always known about the violations of rights and the injustices and the abuses that are faced by migrant farm workers and the way that they have been exacerbated under COVID-19. And we called it unheeded warnings because they proved that they were the direct result, that these violations were the direct result of the many, many years of warnings that migrant workers and their advocates have been issuing to all levels of government who have refused to take the action required to have avoided the crisis that we're now seeing unfold. And what the report outlined and what our direct work with migrant workers, including migrant farm workers, has revealed for us is that, has only proven is what we have known for decades, that the temporary immigration status of migrant farm workers makes it impossible for them to safely assert their rights to decent and safe work. And so this is what has produced the exploitation and the abuse that then became the breeding ground for the COVID-19 outbreaks that we're seeing and the deaths that we're now seeing. Workers know from experience, as Gabriel said, that employers have inordinate control over their lives. And that means that speaking out about unsafe conditions and deplorable housing conditions means termination and loss of income, homelessness, deportation, and possible blacklisting, and forces a lot of workers to make the really difficult decision of staying in Canada without status and putting them at even further risk of exploitation and illness and injury. What it made clear, the report, that we intended to speak on, bring the voices of migrant workers to government with this report, was to say that permanent status is essential for workers to be able to protect themselves from abuse, and now we're seeing from even death. And so the most important recommendation that our report made was around permanent status, and that we need the primary solution to the problems that we are seeing in the migrant farm worker system in Canada is that we need permanent status now for all. What we heard from workers who called us, whose complaints we featured in this report, were all of the same things that Min Sook and Gabriel have spoken of, but just exacerbated: the level of employer control, violation of rights, curtailing of freedoms, locking farmers on farms, inadequate access to food, no access to healthcare, cutting off from social support networks, increased surveillance and policing and threats, increased instances of racism, and in particular anti-Black racism directed towards Caribbean workers. And we use that opportunity to provide a platform for workers to speak out. So we had a worker who spoke about our report at our press conference, who detailed the conditions and the injustices that he saw. And that's where I want to pivot to now. I think it's important for everyone to understand really the extent to which this racist immigration system puts people's livelihoods and lives and dignity at risk. But I think it's also important to focus on the power that workers have when they do organize, and how that is possible and even growing under such extreme situations situations as we're seeing now under COVID. So for MWAC, for example, we have seen that our farm worker membership is growing. We are having more farm workers who want to be part of the struggle for collective change for all migrants and undocumented people in the country. Workers taking leadership roles, forming base groups and worker committees on farms in order to take collective action, everything from marching on their bosses to demand better conditions, to speaking out to media, to calling the Prime Minister, demanding status now. And I want to zero in on one specific example that is really timely tonight and is pertinent right now. Gabriel referenced the challenge that is happening in Haldimand, Norfolk County around, a decision that the health unit had made around limiting the number of people in a bunkhouse that was challenged by one of the larger farmers in that region. One of the biggest farms in the Norfolk region is Scotland Farms. A worker from Scotland was the worker who spoke at our press conference about our report. Scotland was where Juan Lopez Chaparro worked, the third migrant worker who died of COVID-19. The situation at Scotland was very serious when COVID-19 hit. 199 workers at that farm tested positive for COVID-19 at the end of May. These workers were, many of them had spoken out publicly about the deplorable housing conditions, about the abusive working conditions, the pressure that they are under from the employer. One worker in particular who spoke out was then terminated for having spoken out. We are filing a reprisal claim for this worker. And this worker knew Juan Lopez Chaparro. And I want to bring in a quote from this worker who was fired, who has been speaking publicly about what has happened to him. And he said, "What happened to me is what happens to migrant workers when they try to defend their rights. We have been subjected to a system of temporary immigration where if we stand up for ourselves, we are deported. We need a comprehensive immigration solution in order for our rights to be respected. We're an essential part of this economy and society, and we deserve to be treated as such. We deserve equality and respect, and we deserve the same rights. This is why we need permanent status now, so workers can have the power to protect ourselves. Our health, our well-being, our families, and our lives depend on it. I have come here with a message for this government. We will not be silenced by bad employers or by bad laws, but this government must act now if it wants to avoid more abuse and more deaths. And I have a message for all my fellow migrant farm workers and all migrants in Canada. I am not afraid. It is our responsibility to speak up for ourselves and for everyone. We are not alone." And that's where everyone else comes in here and where I want to end. We have over 10,000 people who have signed a petition hosted by the Migrant Rights Network. It's a national network of migrant justice organizations of which MWAC is a part that really kicked into action because of COVID-19, and the level of national organizing has really grown. Over 10,000 people have signed a petition calling for permanent status. We've had over 200 migrant workers just from our base who have literally called Prime Minister Trudeau demanding permanent status for all now. We had workers postering around Trudeau's office in Montreal. We've had workers make phone calls. We've had workers send voice notes and WhatsApp notes to the Prime Minister demanding status for all. And what we are seeing now is that what COVID-19 has exposed the injustices in the system and has really kicked into high gear the urgency of the organizing. We are seeing a massive response from workers who want to organize, who want to be part of the solution and who want to be part of change. And we are building a base of migrant worker power. And that is the key to what is going to fundamentally overturn the unjust and the racist system that has produced all this suffering and this death. And so to do that, we need support from the public. We need financial support. We need political support. We need people to put their support behind migrant workers who are organizing for justice and for the kind of society that all of us want to live in, and pushing the federal government specifically to demand status now. Because without permanent resident status, no other changes in inspection regimes, housing standards, better provincial labor protections, none of those things will be accessible to migrant workers if the question of status is not resolved, which will give workers the power to be able to assert their rights, the power and the choice to be able to leave bad jobs, the power to be able to push back against bad bosses and to push back against the system that is based on their exploitation and their abuse. So we ask for everybody's support on that front. There's some links, I think, that the Inter-Pares crew is going to share at the end, both at the Migrant Rights Network, where you can add your name to the call for permanent status now for all, where you can call the Prime Minister directly through our website, and a link to the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change website, where you can donate and where you can read up on some of the most up-to-date actions that we're doing in support of our worker members. And we ask that people really speak loudly now at this time for the need for status now to really bring justice for migrant workers, migrant farm workers, and for all migrants and undocumented people in Canada.
Thank you so much, Kara, for that really important reminder about about the strength of the migrant workers, but also the need to push our authorities for change. I think that the issue that you raised as well about status, that a lot of people don't understand the vulnerability. I remember in our own program work at Inter-Pares years ago, meeting with migrant workers in Guatemala who had been kicked out of the program because they denounced abuses on Canadian farms, right? And they were expelled from the program. They were told that they had to retract their denunciations of abuse on Canadian farms, and if they refused to do that, then they were out of the program. So, yeah, there's so many pieces, that impact workers because of this issue of the vulnerability about not having status in Canada. So that's a real important demand. And I think that, as you said, we're going to share at the end. We've got our calls to actions, and we've got contact information. I know all of the organizations are strapped for resources right now. So certainly, we encourage people to support all of the organizations that are participating tonight. So yeah, thanks for the three amazing panelists that we've had, because I think each one has shed some light on this system. We're going to take questions now from the audience, from our virtual audience. So if you haven't already, please type them in the Q&A box, and Lorraine's going to read them out to the panelists. And I'll invite maybe our different panelists to respond.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you as well to all the panelists. We have several questions that have come in already. And one I'd like to start with is a question from Gina. And it's asking, what are some other actions that we can take as citizens other than contacting our Prime Minister and local MP to support migrant farm workers?
Yeah, so other actions other than contacting the politicians. Anyone want to take that on?
Yeah, I can start it.
Gabriel, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a powerful question. The simple truth is there's 101 things that you can do. There's no limitation, 101 things. But at the end of the day, what I would really like to tell you and the audience is whatever you're passionate about, just make sure you're connected to something that you're passionate about. Because the issue that we're fighting for, a fairness in the society, a just system, we can attack it from so many angles, right? So do not confine it to just donating PPE for the workers. There's so many ways that you can, you just have to be creative, and whatever way you can help, it all help. It can all help and contribute to the ultimate goal. And what is the ultimate goal? We want a fair society, a just society where all workers are being treated fairly. But there's 101 things. There's so many things that people do, like the documentary that Min Sook have. Draw people's attention to it. Start a discussion at your home with your family. There's so many. We're all connected by food, and think of creative ways. They're farm workers. They're farm workers who've never been to a home in Canada. There's so many ways, so many creative ways. There's so many people. When I landed in Canada, and that is still the pattern. We were just told. Imagine. Coming from a warm country, they tend to dress warm. I thought by coming for a long sleeve, I was warm, and my hat is always, I would always I don't know. There's a lady from Jamaica. Her job is to collect winter jackets and go to the farms and distribute it. So many people use creative ways. There are people in Niagara Falls. There's a lady, I can't remember her name now. She organizes a welcome party for the workers. You know, there's so many, it's unlimited, 101 ways. So I don't know whether that would have you thinking, but there's no limitation. There's no limited number of ways that you can help. But ultimately, it's the unjust laws, the unjust system. That is what we need to change. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Gabriel. I think part of it is just touching, I mean, it's the humanity, touching base with people and connecting with migrant workers, learning more about the situations, listening to their stories and hearing from them, you know? So yeah, as you say, I think there's so many ways, you know?
If I could add, Bill, a little bit to what Gabriel had said.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
I mean, I think that I would just echo what Gabriel said, but I would bring it back like he did and say really fundamentally, I mean, I know people often feel like, you know, calling their MP or calling the Prime Minister or sending an email or things like that feels like it's not enough. But what we are talking about fundamentally is getting at effecting structural systemic change. And it is a way putting public pressure on this government in this time of extreme crisis, where workers have fallen ill, where thousands of workers have fallen ill with COVID, where workers have died of COVID-19, has the capacity to actually change the lives and the livelihoods and the living conditions and the futures of hundreds of thousands of migrant workers in this country. 1 in every 23 people in this country only has temporary immigration status. Our ability to change, fundamentally upend the immigration system has the possibility of impacting the lives of actually millions of people. These are people with families. This has a possibility of impacting migration flows from other countries, the living and working conditions in other countries, of changing foreign policy, Canadian trade policy, Canadian foreign investment policy that produces the kinds of migration flows that we are seeing now, that forces people to make, you know, the least bad of bad choices to come work in Canada under these kinds of extremely exploitative conditions. So our capacity to effect that kind of fundamental policy change is not small. It's actually very big, and the importance of that is very significant, because we are in a moment right now, we know that the federal government is feeling the heat. We hear from them, we are talking to them, we know that they're feeling the heat on this issue. We have never been in a position that we are in right now, where the question of status for all is so publicly palatable, is so commonplace in conversation. Everyone in the media is talking about it. Politicians are talking about it in public and in private. We have never been at such a historic juncture right now in this country, where we have the possibility of winning massive changes to provide permanent residency status to so many people who live and work in this country as temporary migrants or as undocumented migrants. So actually, it may feel like a small thing, but it's actually a tremendously important thing. And it actually has the possibility of making history.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that?
Go for it.
It's so inspiring to speak. I really think people need to recognize the uniqueness of this moment. We are in a political moment in which the entire world is undergoing, you know, is involved in, is witnessing, is part of, engaged in deep political reckoning of systemic structural injustice. How anti-Black racism is foundational to many of the power structures in our society, in which people are, you know, uprising around racist police brutality and making links between racism and capitalism, economic injustice and racism. And this program embodies that. So people need to understand and take the opportunity to seize the moment for pushing for change, because I have never, in 3 decades, I have never seen as much critical action, conversation matched with action, but also political vulnerability on this program as I do now. I've never seen a Prime Minister in Canada speak about migrant workers and social justice in the same sentence. We are finally having the conversation that for too long has been hidden, has been silenced, or the story has been taken over and monopolized from a grower's or employer's perspective. We have to, I think many of us understand that the abuses and the kinds of stories that are in media that you hear about, that's deplorable, it's unacceptable, but we also have to see it's systemic, it's structural. Migrant workers are not victims. The system and the program constructs vulnerability. And the fact that workers have been so outspoken, have taken leadership roles in the migrant justice movement for change in Canada is so remarkable, because the program degrades and dehumanizes people. It's designed to stomp out your spirit, to make you feel like you are less than. I think about Teodoro Bello Martinez, who was the first worker who agreed to work with, to be in the documentary El Contrato. He's been in Canada for 30 years, 3 decades of coming to Canada for 8 months, working on farms, cucumbers and peppers, pays into CPP, pays into EI, can't collect most of EI. Teodoro Bello Martinez, many workers like him come repeatedly, year after year. It's not as, you know, there's a lot of misconceptions about migrant workers. And I was reading in the chat, someone saying they can't, their MP can't tell the difference between, you know, a migrant farm worker and a refugee. And that kind of, you know, racism, that kind of, you know, misunderstanding of the critical role, the essential work, for sure, that migrant workers do in our food industry, but not just in our food industry, as caregivers, as domestic caregivers, you know, in the kill floors, and so many other industries needs to be recognized. And we have to understand that the fact that workers don't have status fundamentally means that these industries have no incentive to improve work conditions, right? So the program itself sustains a deeply exploitative system and workplace.
Thanks, Min. Lorraine, we've got some more, lots of questions coming up. Eh?
We do, yes. Thank you everyone for the questions, and thank you to our panelists for weighing in. So here's another great question from Gina. She says, I've been following some of the public rhetoric surrounding migrant farm work. Some people are concerned about food costs, which further marginalizes racialized communities who can't afford food. Growers assert that they barely churn a profit. What are the fallacies and issues in the food system that need re-examination? How can we reimagine the food system to support all vulnerable communities, including migrant workers?
Okay, can I start off again with this?
Yes, please, Gabriel, go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the question. That's a powerful question. That will take us the whole night, right? We can want to examine so many things. But in a nutshell, let me see a few things I can say. One is, with capitalism, there's that, capitalism does not, there's so many things that goes together with capitalism. Scarcity is one of them. Capitalism thrives on scarcity. Oh, there's a shortage, there's a shortage. That is what capitalism, Canada, there is no shortage of food. If you know about food wastage in just Toronto, you can imagine, if you just know what the amount of food has been wasted in Toronto, you'll understand, it's only then you'll get to understand that food shortage is just a tactic of capitalism. That's one. Number two, in Canada, there's that system that's called the supply management. Supply management. What is that? That is a tool of capitalism to ensure profitability of the employer. That is not a tool to ensure fair distribution. That is a tool for profit. Profit with capitalism, profit comes before any and everything else. And that is what the Canadian food system is based on. During my opening, I said, because of COVID, unemployment is at its highest in Canada. That's the best time for Canadians to fill up the slack on the farm. Why aren't they? Why aren't they? Because of cheap labor. That's what the employers want, cheap labor. Cheap labor, and that means profit. And that is what that is based on. Another thing I would like to say is that there's so many myths out there that if the program is not there, that the cost of food will be increased. The cost of food will be higher. That is a myth. Have you ever seen the financial statement of a farm? Have you ever seen that? You know, with during my first year in Canada, somebody I met in society, he told me 80% of farmers in Ontario are millionaires. That's what a Canadian just told me. I don't have figures and so on, but that's what a Canadian just, an average person told me. 80% of farmers in Ontario are millionaires. That's what the person told me. Have you ever seen a financial statement on the farm where I worked? It is among Canada's, not Ontario, it is among Canada's 50 best managed companies. What does that say? And during COVID, 1 minute the Prime Minister said that the borders are open only to Canadians and permanent residents. It didn't take him long, just a couple of hours, he turned around and said the borders are open to migrant farm workers, the essential workers. What does that say? That tells you how much power and influence that the farmers have as lobbyists. The same Prime Minister who said that the essential workers, but look at the system, are they treated as essential? Are they treated fairly? These are the same people who are being marginalized and not treated fairly. Right now, look at how much of our time is going to make sure they're treated not only as essential, but as treated fair workers, right? And that is what the farmers are using. I call them gray areas. They will tell you things like it is easy to believe. And you know, with myths, once it is repeated and repeated and repeated, and it is who's telling you those things, it is accepted like it is truth, right? And also they have control over the media, right? So there are lots of myths that will tell you that the cost of food will go up and so on. But to get a food system that is healthy, to get a food system that is sustainable, to get a food system that is just, it would entail a lot of things. In the US, I know there's something they call the good food policy, where they would go after the big food giants and pressure them to buy food from that are grown ethically. In Canada, I'm not too sure how that can be done, but there's so many ways. But ultimately, to me, status is the only one tool. Status to me is that main tool that would help us, that would push us closer to getting a food system that is just. Why status? To the average Canadian, status means living in Canada. But to a migrant farm worker, status is a two-edged sword. That status is our painkiller. It takes care of the immigration vulnerability we have, and it takes care of the labor vulnerabilities we have. That is a two-edged sword. That is our painkiller. That is our Advil. That is our Tylenol. That is our painkiller, status. And that's what status is. That is that thing that would put pressure on our employer to create work conditions that keep us and attract us. If we have status, it would give would have an open work permit. By having an open work permit, it allows us to get better conditions. That will force our employer to create a fair system. In a nutshell, that is what I want to say because of time.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you very much for that. So, Min Sook, would you like to?
Also, a couple of things.
Sure.
Gabriel, comments?
Can I just? Well, sure. Can I just say to everyone that it's a little after 8, and I realize not everyone will be able to stay with us right until the end, and I'd like to thank you for joining. But our panelists have kindly agreed to stay until 8:30. Because we have lots of great questions. So if you can stay with us, please do. Okay, so Min Sook and then Karen to answer that last question.
Just to pick up on a point that Gabriel made about the power of story. And for too long, the story of farms in Canada has been authorized and written. And in fact, actively propagated by growers. And so oftentimes people like red barn, some chickens, and then a small crop, like a family farm. And that myth you see constantly reproduced in advertising, in the stories that we tell about farms in Canada. But increasingly, the dominant economic force in Canada's food system are large industrial agribusinesses, and they reap billions of dollars in profit. They are, every year they're making tons of profit. They're not functioning at a loss. And these farms can be like 10 football fields. They're large greenhouses that are operated, computer operated, and high tech and modern. It has nothing to do with seasonal, the seasons or sun coming up and down. It has nothing to do with nature. They're totally divorced from nature. And the way in which they treat and organize the workers in these farms is like an industrial Fordist assembly line. And workers are forced to work fast and to work hard, and are constantly hectored to work repeatedly in a way in which they're forced to compete against each other. You know, workers who complete a line the fastest are, you know, given a mark, and names are put up in terms of who's the most productive that particular day. Every day, the kind of oppression of producing and working as hard as possible to, you know, for the profit of this large industrial company, that's constantly being repeated to workers' faces. And it's done in a way in which racism within farms, employers, what they do in large farms is they'll never hire a worker from just Guatemala. That workforce won't be just from one country. What they intentionally do is hire workers from many different countries, and then they pit workers against each other. And they'll say, well, you know, this workforce is much stronger and much faster and much more agreeable than you. And so that, you know, the kind of sowing the seeds of dissension is a classic tool that employers use to pit workers against each other, as opposed to, you know, recognizing the structure of power. And that's why it's so remarkable and important for us to understand that workers get this. They know the way in which the program and the employers use race to try and divide workers, and they fight against that, and they build solidarity against that. So I think this idea of the single farm and the family that's running it, that doesn't, that's a myth, and it's a minority of farmers. And farmers have deep political clout. As in Ontario, the local political power that farmers have, they contribute to the Conservative government. They contribute the maximum that they can every year to the local Conservative candidates, and have also to Liberal candidates. Never to NDP candidates, of course. And so they ensure that their political power is also entrenched. And that's why farm workers cannot join a union in Ontario.
Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, Gabriel and Min Sook said it perfectly, but I want to talk again about where the political buck stops. When it comes to how the agri-food sector in Canada is actually organized, and who calls the shots, and who profits, and on the backs of whom, and at cost to what. So, you know, like Gabriel was saying, you know, the work of migrant farm worker really subsidizes the agri-food sector in this country. So does the rest of the public in Canada through taxes, for example. So over 70% of government subsidies that go to the agri-food sector go to those businesses with over $500 million in profits. So these are not the small family farms, like Min Sook was saying, right? These are not your small family farms who are getting any of the government support to the agri-food sector. The same government that turns around and bemoans, you know, the poor farmer when people start to talk about the rights of workers and the dignity and the decency of the jobs that they work in. And Canada is the 6th largest exporter of agri-food products in the world. So there is a lot of money in this sector. There is a lot of money in this sector being organized the way that it is, that is pushing out actually small family farms that are drowning in debt right now because government subsidies, and because the taxation system, and because the way that the economy is organized in the agri-food sector privileges those who make the most money, who, as Min Sook was saying, make so much profit and have continued to profit during COVID-19. So again, that's an important piece around action, right? Is to say that we know that provincially and federally, governments are responding to the interests of the companies with the most money in this sector, of the agri-food interests that profit off of a low-wage exploitable migrant worker model, and that profit off of massive government handouts, including during COVID, right? Billions of dollars in handouts from the government to the agri-food sector, supposedly to prevent outbreaks of COVID. And what have we seen? Outbreaks of COVID and deaths of migrant workers. So that question of like capitalism and who is in charge and who calls the shots, and the way that both the public and farm workers through their labor are subsidizing the profits of a very few number of companies that have dominated the sector and are dominating the policies around the sector. That is a key place where people can actually take some action and put some pressure to say that if we really want a sustainable food system, it behooves all levels of government, and it behooves all of us to ensure that we have a food system that is based around feeding people, and that people who work in that food system can work in decent jobs. to deal with the domestic labor shortage and all of these things, right? That is a fundamentally sustainable and just food system. And we have the power to be able to pressure the government to make that happen.
Can I add something quickly? Only today in the US, the big companies, Apple, whatever, they were under scrutiny, right? They said they have so much power that's affecting the US economy. But that's what COVID is doing. In Alberta, where there was an outbreak of COVID in a particular meat processing plant, and that's in line with the conversation here. When Canada food is concentrated in the hands of a few, what would happen when COVID breaks up at a plant? Is that a food system that we want? And that is what COVID is doing. It's helping us to re-examine the food system that we are. Is that what we want, or isn't it? Can we see clearly that it's based on profit before anything else? So these are important issues that we need to re-examine, and COVID is really putting everything into perspective for us. Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah,
I think one of the things too, when Min was talking earlier, it made me think too about when we had a delegation years ago of migrant workers from Guatemala, and what we were hearing too is this competition, some of the embassies or the consulates, they're not helping their workers from their own country because they want the remittances to be sent back home. So if workers from a particular country are having a problem, they basically often, we were told, they tell the workers to shut up because they don't want the Jamaicans or the Trinis or the people from whatever country to have a bad reputation of not being good workers. By good workers, you mean the ones who will be the most submissive, right? The ones who won't complain, who will work 14-hour days, who won't make demands. And so sometimes when you think that your own consulate is going to help, they don't. Anyway, was just back to you, Lorraine.
Can I add something there, Bill? Just because I kind of raised it and I realized I wasn't really clear. The way in which this program fits into a global system, the coloniality of power. I think we also need to recognize that, because it's not just this isolated program that's running along on its own. It's speaking to this broader structure, global capitalism, right? And the history of colonialism is embedded into this program. So, when I was in Doha a few years ago and I was filming in migrant worker camps there, and I was talking to migrant workers, the stories that they were telling me about paying recruiter fees, about not being able to access healthcare, about living in crowded circumstances and dangerous work and not being paid even sometimes work, to all of those stories are stories I've heard in Canada. And I realized I didn't know that, traveling halfway across the world, I would be in such a familiar space. But because these programs create that, in some ways, there are these borderless zones of exploitation within Canada's own borders, right? So we're familiar with export processing zones in other countries where people are, working in factories and producing, gadgets that, and within those zones, there's no labor regulations, there's no environmental regulations, and taxes are not applied. And those products come, outside of countries in the global South. Well, migrant worker programs create, these kinds of zones, labor zones of a labor apartheid within Canada's borders, right? And the role that consulate reps play is in aligned to the systems of power. And what they do is they tell workers, if you don't like it, there are hundreds of other workers in your town who will replace you. So you be grateful and shout, right? And I remember a worker, Sheldon McKenzie, died in Leamington. He was a Jamaican worker, and there was a workplace accident, and he died. And the Jamaican consul just wanted to send him back to Jamaica, as opposed to trying to access medical services for him. Repeatedly, I see consulate reps telling workers, just shut up and put up with a system that is deeply abusive and exploitative, because it is sending, international currency and remittances back home. So there's a way in which that money is being used, in those nation states.
Thank you. We'll try to fit in a couple more questions here. One of them is from Celia. Is there any difference between the larger agribusinesses and the genuine family farms in terms of the migrant worker experience? conditions.
Min Sook, do you want to touch on that? And one thing that I'm wondering if you might mention as well, I know that yeah, you were threatened with legal action for from your film El Contrato from agribusiness, right? What if you?
Yeah, and I think Gabriel probably can speak very well to this, because that's, you know, the difference between agribusiness and then smaller, you know, independent farms that are trying to figure out a way to resist all the structural inequities. Just to say, you know, the role of agribusiness in controlling the status quo, in ensuring the system remains as such, part of that role is actively repressing stories that contradict the myth that they want to continue reproducing. You know, the familiar and friendly family farm, you know, on Canadian soil. And, you know, when El Contrato, the first doc I made back in 2000, and I made that with the National Film Board of Canada, when we tried to release it, the growers in Leamington launched a libel suit and served me with libel papers, and also the producers. It was, and they threatened $1 million libel suit. And anyone who would screen the film, who proposed to screen the film, was served libel, you know, information of a libel suit that would be pending. So they effectively censored and shut down the documentary from being distributed, you know, for a full year. And then, you know, cycle back, you know, fast forward to now, Migrant Dreams, the film trying to get that film, you know, shown. When it was screened in Windsor at the Windsor Film Festival, the local grower, which is not a small family farm, a large, you know, agribusiness that actually is, you know, exporting food to the South and thinking of expanding in America as well. They pulled all their sponsorship money out of the film festival. So there's an active repression of storytelling that brings out, you know, the truth of what's happening on farms.
Thank you for that. Another question here. Are there important differences among the provinces? This is a question from Lisa. She said, I was told at a conference that the provincial legislation in Manitoba is better than in Ontario.
Okay, can I add a few things to that? The program, that particular program, in Canada, we know when it comes to immigration, there are several immigration programs, right? Several programs that bring in workers. But the one that I'm familiar with, the one that brought me to Canada is the one, it's called the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. That's the one that started in 1966. This is a federal program. And that's the reality of that figure. It's a federal program, but it is across Canada, and it goes through, so it goes across all those different jurisdictions. But look at that, the provinces has their own employment or labor standards, right? The labor laws. So in each province, these are the little things that would vary from province to province. But it's a federal program. But what is the program really? What is the program? That's a gift to every farmer. Look at the gift. Whether you're a large corporation, I'm tying my worker to you. We have a tied work permit. I'm tied to my employer without the rights as a Canadian. I don't have the same rights as a Canadian. I'm doing the non-unionized work. That is it. That's the program. So is there a treatment? Is there fair treatment? That's it. You know. That's a gift. That's a government's gift to farmers. Whether you're small, big, large, medium, whatever, that's a gift. I have somebody tied to you, do not have the same rights as a Canadian, and to do your dirty work. And look at that. The same farmers, they will tell you, I treat my workers well. I treat my workers like family. It's so nice to believe that, right? Another myth that you'd hear, it's a few bad apples, a few bad apples. It's so easy to believe. But look at the apple tree. Look at the apple tree. One, I cannot apply for status. And in Canada, if you don't have status, you don't have right. So the apple trees, I cannot apply for status. I am tied to you. What does that mean? I'm at your mercy. What kind of apples would you get from that tree? A few bad apples or bad apple tree? And that is how they play on our minds. Buy local. When we are buy local, it's nicely packaged. You think of freshness and good health and so on. But the real story, the complete story, we do not hear them. When you go to the farmer's market, you only see the white hands, the white ones, you think of the family farm, but the black people of color who do all the dirty work, you don't see that. That's hidden. And the whole program is designed to make us invisible. And that's why I'm proud to be seated with Min Sook to bring that to the fore. The whole story is hidden. Canada is silent about it. Canada makes it invisible. And there's so many invisibilities. And that is what COVID is doing. It is now exposing those who have fallen through the cracks. Thank you.
Thanks.
If I could also add, Lorraine, on the national question and some of the differences.
Sure, go ahead.
So, I mean, there's the seasonal, the SOP program that Gabriel was talking about, which, you know, is specific to certain parts. The majority of the workers that come through that program come to certain parts of the country, largely to Ontario and some BC. And then there's the temporary foreign worker stream in agriculture, where a lot of the workers in Quebec come to that program. And some of the workers who participate in the different programs tend to come from different countries, not exclusively, but there is a bit of a division. And then there's the whole agri-food sector, right? So it's not just farming, crop production and harvesting and packaging, but there's greenhouses that are not just food producing greenhouses, flower greenhouses, things like that, fruit and tender fruit orchards, aquaculture, fisheries on the East Coast, right, which rely very much on temporary foreign workers, TFWs through the TFW stream, not through the SOP program, meat processing and meat production. So the first largest outbreak in the agri-food system in Canada was at JBS Cargill in Alberta, where the majority of those workers were temporary foreign workers, and who similarly had concerns about fearing the risk of deportation if they said anything about their working conditions that they knew were going to expose them to COVID-19. So there's a lot of variety in that way across the country, but there is not a lot of variety in fundamentally what the issues are and the ways that policies have put workers at risk. And this question again about good farms versus bad farms, or family farms versus big farms, or good employers versus bad employers. Sometimes good employers do bad things, and sometimes bad employers do good things. We can't rely on luck and chance to ensure that people are treated with dignity and respect. And fundamentally, that doesn't change. If someone posted an article quoting some farmers who, you know, are talking about how they try and do right by their workers and things, but fundamentally that doesn't get at the systemic imbalance of power between workers and employers that always exists, no matter the context. And so really, I think it's important to have an analysis about how the food system in Canada is actually structured, and who profits and who doesn't, and how much some people profit on the backs of so many others, but also to understand that throwing our lot in with workers and getting behind workers and their self-organization and their demands for change actually is about getting fundamentally at that power imbalance between employers and workers, and tipping the scales back in the favor of workers. And fundamentally, that is the only thing that's really going to change the conditions, raise the conditions for all workers, change the way the food system is organized, and change all of these sort of the kinds of exploitation that we're seeing, because it is putting the power back and the support back in the hands of those people who make the system work.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks so much. I think we're probably, unfortunately, it looks like we're coming down to the end of the time now. So I think, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for the questions. We'll have to, I think we need to have another one of these webinars at some point, or find ways to follow up. And certainly we've got the contact information for people to continue the discussion, but we really appreciate this. I think just as a final note, I just like to invite each of the panelists, if you can just say in a minute, you know, I'm afraid instead of 2 minutes, but just if you can take 1 minute, what do you think is the most important takeaway for people tonight? And how can we be more effective allies with migrant workers in the struggle for justice and equality? Big question, but if, yeah, Min, do you want to start? And then Gabriel, and then Karen? Oops, your mic's not on.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce how incredibly important this moment is, and not to lose this moment, this window of political change. And I've never seen anything like it in terms of the kind of, you know, change we're seeing underway, you know, change that's cascading, and it feels like there's this way in which people are finally, you know, tapping into not just rage, but also analysis, but also the necessity for political action. There's this way in which we are in a moment of deep political change. It feels to me like it's absolutely a revolutionary moment for change. And this is the moment when we can collectively pressure those who have power, federally, provincially, locally, to make changes to a system that is so unjust, that defines injustice. And someone was asking, oh, well, what about in Manitoba, for example? Yeah, well, in Manitoba, there's regulations to regulate recruiters and to license recruiters and to monitor the activities of recruiters. And it has made a difference. It has meant that the kinds of recruitment fees are no longer paid, the kind that we see in Ontario, right? So change is absolutely possible, but it's not going to happen if you just ask politely for it. We have to organize and mobilize and do so with migrant workers, in the leadership position.
Great, thanks so much. Gabriel, a minute. What do you think we should do?
Okay, a couple of things. One is during COVID has really brought us to that question. Where is my food coming from? How safe? For how long can I stay at home and being ensured, with a fair, a sustainable food supply? We've been asking ourselves that question. But the question I want to ask you is that the food that you eat can be the safest form of your medicine, and it can also be your slowest form of your poison. Also, I want to tell you, are you concerned whether your food is being produced by those who respect the soil, who respect the environment, respect the workers, or those who exploit the soil, the environment, and the workers? And the last question I want to ask you, do you want a society that is built on fear, or do you want a society that's built on hope? And if based on that, then be connected. Once you're connected to whichever you're connected to, just be passionate about it and work towards a society that can transform the food system. In a nutshell, that's what I would like to with you. Just be connected with yourself. Once you're passionate with it, whatever way that you're passionate, you'll just be creative in coming up with ways to push people to action that brings a food system that's healthy, that's sustainable, and that's just. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Gabriel. Karen.
Echo what both of those two said, absolutely, about the importance of this moment and about taking collective action and about asking really hard questions about the kinds of food system, the kinds of immigration policy, the kinds of society that we want to have. And I would just say, speaking on the question of power, is that really we have an opportunity, I think, to throw all of us who may not be migrant farm workers, all of us who may not be undocumented, to throw our power behind the leadership of migrant and undocumented people that are organizing and demanding for change, and that the power is going to come from there. Fundamentally throwing our lot in behind the power of migrant and undocumented folks who are organizing will upend, has the possibility to upend the system that we are living in right now. Throwing in with workers who are organizing on farms and in the food system will upend the food system and capitalism and the racism in the immigration system. So it's really throwing down behind workers is the thing that I think will get us the furthest.
Thank you. Lorraine, over to you.
Thank you all. So yes, thank you to our excellent panelists and to everyone who joined the conversation today on migrant worker rights. We encourage you to take action as outlined by the panelists to ensure fair treatment of valued workers who help to put food on our tables. Some links to take action have been shared in the chat, and we also welcome your continued engagement with Interpares. You can get in touch anytime using the contact information on the screen here. So thank you all, and goodbye for now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Huh? Ciao.